Good morning. We look today at Job 3 and 4. And in Job 3, he laments the day he was born. He asks for that day to be cursed. He asks that he would never be born. And, we've heard things like that other places and stuff as well. And, some of those may come because we first heard it in the book of Job. Chapter 3 starts, after this, his three friends have come. They've sat 7 days and 7 nights in silence. And then Job begins to speak. He curses the day of his birth. And, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man's child is conceived. He's wishing he'd never been born. And at some point in our lives, or in people's lives, many have wished that same thing, and sometimes, we have a lot of suicides in our world today, and it's, people get depressed, people get down, people are lamenting like Job. They can't seem to find any good about a lot of things. However, Job is different, in so many ways, because even though he laments that he's born and he wishes the day had never happened, his faith in God doesn't waver. He doesn't curse God. And as we come, as we get to verse 11, I think it is the first time the word why. Why did I not die at birth? 12, why were there knees to receive me? And we're going to see that word why so many times in the book of Job. And we ask that word so many times in our own lives, why is this and why is that? And in Job's day, in the days of Job and so many of the way back in history, Israelites, the blessings and the curses were all from God. Good and evil were both from God. And we've read that in different places. God blessed Jacob and he had many sons. God worked for good through the evil that his brothers did to Joseph. And we find examples of that, and believes in that. But yet in the book of Job, we find that, it was Satan that brought these calamities upon Job. God allows it to happen, just as he allows thunderstorms and rain and hail and sunshine and warm weather, and the world has been set into motion and all of that. But with Job, he regrets being born, and he laments about that, and he cries out, and he's expressing his deep innermost feelings to these friends of his. And he's not really asking their advice in any of it per se, but he's expressing his innermost hurt and his pain and that, and verse 20, why is light given to one in misery and life to the bitter in the soul who long for death, but it does not come? We can read a lot into these things, and stuff that way. And, in verse 22, who are rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they finally find the grave, and that's, Paul writes in the New Testament that, he's just eagerly anticipating being in heaven with God, and death, could come at any time and he'd be just fine. But then he realizes that, his time isn't yet, that God's got more for him to do, God's got more for him to do. He's got more to do, more to accomplish with his life that way. But Job is sharing, the why and the what and the wherefore, and God isn't really mentioned more than just the one time in verse 23, toward the end of his lament, that he talks about God. He says, why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in? It's that it isn't a cry against God. It isn't any of that, but he's talking about God yet. He hasn't forgotten about God. He hasn't forgiven. He hasn't turned his back on God. He says, my sighing comes like my breath, and my groanings are poured out like water. And we hear those words echoed in Psalm 22, my bones are out of joint, and it's this time of deep hurt. And I think another lesson we learned from this chapter of Job is that when we hurt, when we just are at a loss for, what could have happened, talk it out, just express your emotions. And in today's world, we need to, be wary of who we express our emotions to. We all end up having that come to kind of to bite us in the butt sometimes. You share some of your innermost deep feelings or your hurts or whatever with somebody, and they turn around and in their well-meaning, they tell somebody else that, and then that person comes to you and says, I hear this, and it's just kind of, you're floored by that. But we need to talk, and sometimes we need to know of the confidentiality when we talk and stuff that way. And sometimes being the confidant of someone's confessions that way, can put a burden on you if you are that confidant that way, if someone is sharing with you. But it's important to realize that if someone shares their deepest emotions, their deepest hurts with you, it's because they trust you, because they need an outlet, and they look at you as a safe person. And that when we find ourselves as that person that they come to, that we need to honor their privacy and be so cautious with that. And we could go on a lot more from that anyway. So then we get done with chapter 3, and Job has shared his feelings. And then the first of his friends, Eliphaz, the Temanite, if one might venture a word with you, will it offend you? If a word of advice, my friend, or this is what I see, this is what I hear. And and sometimes, I've said this before, sometimes when we're listening, we're not really listening. Our minds are so busy trying to figure out the answer to solve the problem that we don't listen, we don't hear. But he says, if one might venture a word, who can keep from speaking? When we hear all of this, when we hear your deep hurt, how can we not respond? And so often to remain sitting there in silence isn't such a good thing. But yet sometimes it's okay just to have let this person talk and to express their feelings, and to let them then, after they've verbalized it, sometimes after we verbalize something, after we say it out loud, even if we say it out loud only to ourselves, or we say it out loud to God, it helps us in our own mind process it, because we've put it out there, and we've looked at it, and it's just like when you write something down, it's there, and then you can process it better. But anyway, Eliphaz says, can I visit with you? And then he compliments him. You have instructed many. You have strengthened the weak. Your words have supported those who are stumbling. You have made firm feeble knees. You have been an example. You have been an encourager. You've been a supporter. But now it's come to you, and you are impatient, he says. It touches you, and you are dismayed. You're surprised that all of a sudden, God has taken everything away from you. But yet he, really didn't blame God in here, per se that way. But, he says, is your fear of God, and then verse 6, is not your fear of God, your respect of God, your confidence and integrity in all of your ways and hope. And, so he asks if it's okay to speak, and then he reminds him of the good person he is, of the good that he's done in other people's lives, and how he has, been a pillar of society, and how many people rely on him. When he had these herds and these flocks and these servants and all of that, he was responsible for the well-being of a lot. And then the question, think now, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? So, I mean, here now it's, if you're innocent, this shouldn't have happened to you. If you haven't sinned, this shouldn't happen to you. So, I mean, it's, he's saying that, the only reason that this could have happened, the only reason that God would have taken this away is that you sinned greatly against God. And, in verse 8, as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same, And, I mean, if you do evil, and if you sow trouble, if you get the same thing back, it's you reap what you sow. And so here he's kind of pointing a finger at Job, saying, you've done something, and it's coming back at you, and by the breath of God they perish, by the blast of his anger they are consumed, and then the strong lion perishes for lack of prey, and then verse 12, it seems like he's talking about a vision he's had. Now a word came stealing to me. He's had this revelation of some sort. My ear received the whisper of it. And, it's something that comes to him, and we've had that experience that, you're doing something, all of a sudden this thought comes to your mind or whatever it is. But, he asks the question, can mortals be righteous before God? Can human beings be pure before their Maker? And we know that none of us is sinless. None of us is pure. And so these conversations are kind of hard to deal with, but yet we realize that so often, these same things happen in our world yet today. And so I think a lesson we can take from this is that when we listen to someone's heartache, or when we pour our own heartaches out to someone, so when we listen, first of all, not to point fingers, not to put blame, but to find a way of encouraging, to find a way of hope. And when we need to have someone listen to us, have utmost faith and trust in this person that we go to. And if necessary, say these words. I really need you to keep this in confidence. It's something I need to talk about. Don't put that word but in there, because that's always an opposite direction deal. But it's important in our lives to have friends who will seek us out when we have trouble. It's important for us to know that we can share our inner hurts with others, and that we don't need to worry about them being spread out through everything. And that's, when we talk to God, when we pray to God, we know that God isn't going to say anything to anyone else. But it's, as I said earlier today too, when we pray it out loud to God, it helps us think it through. And we take our concerns and our troubles to God each and every day. Tomorrow morning we have worship at 9 o'clock at Mabel and Sutton. You're welcome to join us live on Facebook. And may God richly bless you again today.